Yeah. You left out one of my favorites from Marvel. I think the favorite work that I ever did, and I think it's the best work I ever did for Marvel, was Captain America: Theater of War. Those are ones that are like a love letter to the American military. And so people will kind of go, well, why? You're a Brit, right? Yeah, but I come from a military family, and it's not like I don't understand the plight of the common soldier. And so one thing that I might mention, because if I'm going to slap myself on the back, it's worth saying, Chris Evans apparently spent his entire 3 or 4 movies walking around with one copy of one comic book that was Mythos Captain America. And he said quite famously that it was the epitome of the American soldier. This was the heart of Captain America. I believe him. I agree with him. I think the story that we wrote for Mythos was, and we'll get into this in talking about writing, the fundamental thing that I think, I don't know if it sets me apart, but it's the thing that I do, which is to find the why. Why is there a point to this? And so in Mythos, the premise was that, if anyone's familiar with the origin of Captain America, you're probably more familiar than I am, right? But if you think about it, he starts and he's on the steps, right, in this origin story, and he's reading a comic book, and there's a bully with like a catapult, like bullying him in the street as he's trying to read a comic. And so the premise that I put forward is that he would have been born before the war, right? So he's born during the Depression. And one of the things that happens is he doesn't know his dad. His dad dies, right? So he's raised by a single mother. And the premise that I put forward is that he goes to enlist with the same kid that was bullying him, this kid called Doug Huggins. And when he goes to enlist, Doug goes because he's bored, and he goes because he really wants to enlist. But his whole reason for enlisting is so that he can be in the Blue Spaders, the 17th Infantry, so he can be in his father's regiment, because he never knew his father. And so once you get that connection to why someone would want to serve their country, why they care about it, why they have this love for their country, because America can tend at its worst to be kind of really jingoistic. But I have many very close friends who are in the American military who are incredible patriots, right? And so he goes to enlist, he becomes Captain America. Now he ends up going to war with Doug Huggins in the same regiment, the Blue Spaders, and they go to Sicily, and then he ends up pinning the Medal of Valor to that same guy. And at the very end of the book, spoiler alert, he's with Doug, and they're at the regimental dinner, and all the old boys are there. And of course, he's a young man, and now he's feeding Doug at the table, and all the old boys fade out, and it's just him and Doug. And he says,
another chill, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Now I got to go and read all these. These are all things I got to look up and find now.
Right. You got to go find this stuff. You got to find Mythos, right? Because I think what we did with Mythos, they're probably some of the hardest books I've ever written, but they were some of the most rewarding. And from Captain America, I will tell you this. I'm not going to keep doing spoilers all night, but I will tell you that when I got a phone call from Tom Brevoort, and he said, Paul, I know the answer to this, but do you want to write some Captain America? We've got this project called Theater of War, and they're oversized 35-page issues. And I said, yeah, I want to make some pitches. And I called him back about half an hour later with 4, and we did all 4 of them. And the first one that I pitched to him, I told him the story. I did it like we're talking, and I told it to him. And as I finished the story, the last page, Tom let out a little involuntary laugh. And I said, I know what you're doing, Tom. You're trying not to cry, aren't you? And he said, you bastard.
Yeah, to turn his camera, the little tears just slide down.
Yeah. So in the end, and one of the things that I think will really move people is that, I wrote about Doug Huggins being this character, but Doug Huggins was my next door neighbor. He was on the USS St. Louis when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and his best friend Bobby Shaw was killed on the Arizona. And I interviewed Doug. I have him on film. But what's so great is I actually got to do a picture of Doug and also of Bobby, right? And so one of the main characters in one of the things was Bobby Shaw as well. Another main character was one of my best friends, a guy called Brian Anderson, who's a triple amputee. He was the first triple amputee to survive his wounds in Iraq. So I got to do real core stuff, and I think that's why Chris Evans kind of saw that as being, and I'm not really fond too much of reviews, because it doesn't matter if someone doesn't like something of mine. Genuinely, to me, it's okay. I'm fine with it. And it's also hard to get too much praise, because I think it's just like, it's subjective, right? But I will say that series gave me my favorite review ever, which was a Marine veteran who had PTSD, who wrote in to say that it took a British writer and an Italian artist to teach him the true meaning of American patriotism.